Most anglers have spent $200, $300, sometimes $500 putting together a fishing setup before they ever realized that the guy catching fish 2 docks down was running something that cost less than a decent dinner. That happens more than people want to admit. The fishing industry is very good at making you feel like you need more than you do, and it starts the moment you walk into any tackle shop or scroll through any product listing online. More bearings, lighter blanks, premium coatings, pro staff approved technology, all of it is designed to make the gap between what you have and what you think you need feel as wide as possible. Here's the reality. A thoughtfully chosen $100 setup, rod, reel, line, and a handful of terminal tackle and lures can handle the majority of freshwater fishing situations most anglers encounter throughout an entire season. Not every situation, not every species, not every technique, but most of what average anglers are doing on average water on an average weekend, $100 can cover that, honestly and effectively. Hit subscribe before we get into it, because this channel is about giving you straight information without the sales pitch. And this one is going to challenge some assumptions you might have about what you actually need on the water. I'm Jerry Davis, and I've spent enough time around boats, tackle shops, and fishing gear to know when anglers are paying for performance and when they're paying for packaging. Today, I want to walk you through a complete fishing setup you can put together for right around $100, built around components that are genuinely reliable, appropriately matched to each other, and capable of handling the kinds of fishing that most people actually do. By the end, you'll know exactly what to spend, where to spend it, what to skip, and why this approach makes more sense than a lot of the advice you'll find from people trying to sell you something. Let's start with the rod, because it's where most beginners either overspend on something they don't need or underspend on something that falls apart after 2 trips. For a $100 all-around setup, you are looking at a spinning rod in the $25 to $35 range. That might make some people nervous, and I understand that. But here's what you need to understand about rods at that price point right now. The blank construction and guide quality on entry-level rods from brands like Shakespeare Ugly Stick, Zebco Crappy Fighter, or even the St. Croix Triumph at the lower end of that line have improved considerably compared with what you would have found 10 years ago. More importantly, you can look directly at what matters on a rod, the guides, the blank, and the reel seat, without paying much attention to what name is printed on the side. For general freshwater use, a medium power, moderate fast action spinning rod in the 6 to 6'6" range is going to cover the most ground. That combination gives you enough backbone to set a hook through a fish's mouth reliably, enough tip sensitivity to feel lighter bites, and enough length to make reasonable casts without being awkward to control in tight spots near shorelines or docks. A medium light setup will work better for finesse applications and smaller species. But if you're buying one rod to do almost everything, medium power, moderate fast is the most forgiving option across the widest range of techniques. What you want to check, whether you're buying online or in a store, is guide alignment and guide quality. Ceramatic or aluminum oxide guides are standard at this price point and are completely acceptable for spinning setups. What you want to avoid is guides that are noticeably misaligned, guides with rough interior surfaces, or a reel seat that feels loose or wobbly when you attach your reel. These issues are not signs of a budget rod doing budget things. They are signs of poor quality control, and a little inspection before you buy prevents a lot of frustration on the water. The Ugly Stick GX2 consistently comes up in angler conversations as a rod that delivers durability beyond its price. It is not the most sensitive rod in this range, and it is heavier than graphite options at higher price points. But for anglers who are hard on equipment, put rods in truck beds, or are teaching beginners who don't always handle gear carefully, that fiberglass composite construction holds up in a way that a lighter graphite blank at the same price sometimes does not. Anglers consistently report using these rods for years without significant issues, which is exactly the kind of information that matters more than what the spec sheet says. Now, pair that rod with a spinning reel in the $25 to $40 range, and you start to see why a $100 complete setup is more realistic than it might sound at first. The reel is where most people get confused by numbers. They look at bearing counts, maximum drag numbers, and gear ratios, and they assume more of each is better. That is not always how it works. A reel with 10 bearings, where 6 of those are cheap, poorly shielded, and likely to corrode after a few rainfalls, is not a better reel than one with 4 quality bearings that are properly positioned where they actually matter: in the line roller, the handle, and the drivetrain. For a $100 setup, you want a spinning reel in the 2,000 to 3,000 size range, which is the most versatile size for general freshwater fishing. At this price point, Shimano's Sienna and Sedona lines, the Penn Battle 3 at the lower end, and the Daiwa Fuego LT all represent options where the gear construction, drag system, and overall build quality are honest for what you're paying. The Shimano Sienna in particular is one of those reels that anglers regularly describe as fishing well above its price, largely because the propulsion line management system, which is just Shimano's term for the spool design and oscillation system, handles line lay well enough to reduce tangles and casting inconsistency in reel use. Now, I want to be clear about something. A $30 spinning reel is not going to fish like a $150 Shimano Stratic or a Daiwa Tatula. The drag on the budget reel is going to be less consistent under pressure. The bearings are going to feel less smooth when you push them. The bail spring is a potential failure point over time. Those are real trade-offs, and pretending they don't exist would not be honest. What I'm telling you is that for recreational freshwater fishing, panfish, bass, walleye, trout in relatively clean freshwater with occasional light use, those trade-offs don't show up in a way that costs you fish with any regularity. They become relevant when you're fishing heavy cover for large fish repeatedly throughout the week, when you're in saltwater, or when the reel is your primary tool and it needs to perform reliably for years under real strain. That's who should spend more on a reel. Anglers who fish twice a month on a local pond targeting bass in the 2 to 3 pound range, the Sienna or Sedona at $30 to $40 is going to do the job honestly. Now let's talk line, because this is genuinely one of the most overlooked components in a budget setup. And it is also where you can make a disproportionately good decision without spending much money. For a $100 all-around setup, I would recommend spooling your reel with 8 to 10 pound monofilament as your primary option if you are fishing general freshwater situations, shallow to mid-depth, moderate cover, bass, panfish, walleye, trout. Monofilament in this price range still offers good knot strength, enough stretch to absorb the shock of a fish running hard, and enough forgiveness for knots tied by anglers who are still learning. A 100-yard spool of decent monofilament from Berkley Trilene XL, P-Line CXX, or even Stren Original in this range is going to cost you between $5 and $10 and is genuinely adequate for this setup. Berkley Trilene XL has one of the longest track records in freshwater fishing, and its soft, manageable feel off the spool makes it forgiving on a budget spinning reel, where line management is already a slight concern. If you want to use braid as a main line and add a monofilament or fluorocarbon leader, that approach works well, but it also adds cost and complexity. For a beginner or casual angler putting together a first serious setup, straight monofilament is the practical choice. For someone with more experience who is targeting specific situations, fishing deep, fishing around heavy abrasive cover, or fishing in clear water where visibility matters, a short fluorocarbon leader tied to a braided mainline makes sense. But that starts to push the budget and adds a rigging step that matters a lot less when you're fishing a local pond for bluegill or light bass. Allocate roughly $8 to $12 online. That's a reasonable budget that buys you quality without adding stress to the rest of the setup. That leaves you somewhere around $15 to $30 for terminal tackle and a small selection of lures. And this is where a smart $100 setup actually proves its value over a disorganized, expensive one. Most anglers, if you asked them to look honestly at their tackle box, would find lures they've thrown twice, soft plastics in colors they don't use, and jigs with bent hooks from being dropped on concrete. They've spent more money on what's collecting dust than on what actually catches fish. So when you're building a setup around a budget, the constraint actually forces you to think about what matters. For a general freshwater all-around setup, here is what covers the most ground for the least money. A few sizes of offset worm hooks in the range of size 1 through 3/0, paired with straight tail or straight shank plastic worms in natural colors like green pumpkin or watermelon, is one of the most versatile and effective soft plastic setups in freshwater fishing. These are not exotic. They are not new. They work consistently across multiple species in multiple conditions because they imitate something fish are already looking for. A pack of 10 hooks and 2 packs of worms in complementary colors will run you around $6 to $8 total and give you a presentation that produces fish in clear water, stained water, shallow grass, docks, and rocky bottom alike. Add a small selection of 1/4 ounce to 3/8 ounce jig heads for rigging those same plastics without Texas rigging, and you've opened up more depth and presentation options without adding much cost. A pack of jig heads in 2 sizes costs around $4 to $6 and covers both light presentations for panfish and moderate presentations for bass. A few small spinners, something like a rooster tail or a small inline spinner, cover moving water trout fishing and work reasonably well for bass and panfish in open water. These typically run $3 to $5 a piece, and 2 or 3 of them in different sizes handle more situations than most anglers realize. Here's what I'd leave out of the $100 setup, at least initially: deep diving crankbaits, expensive topwater lures, and specialty swim baits. These have their place and work well in the right conditions, but they require specific techniques, specific water conditions, and some experience to use effectively. They also cost more per lure and are more likely to be lost to snags before the average angler gets enough practice to fish them productively. Start with what you can control, fish confidently, and add specialty lures as the situations call for them. Think about the last time a lure loss ended a fishing trip for you. That is a budget and technique problem more than an equipment problem. A single lost crankbait on an $8 setup is a worse experience than the same snag with a $2 jig head and a soft plastic you can replace from a pack. Let me also say this about matching the rod, reel, and line, because I see setups where someone has a light rod paired with a heavy capacity reel, or they've loaded 10-pound braid onto a reel with an inadequate drag and a guide set that creates line noise at every retrieve. An all-around $100 setup works best when you choose components that make sense together. A medium action 6-foot spinning rod, a 2,000 to 2,500 size spinning reel, and 8 to 10 pound monofilament or 10 to 15 pound braid with a monofilament leader are a matched combination. The rod's power suits the line class. The reel size suits the rod length. The line diameter suits the guide size. None of these components creates friction against another, and that consistency of feel is part of what makes even a budget setup fish well when the components are chosen thoughtfully. This is the detail that most buying guides skip over. Matching components is not only about performance, it is about confidence. When your setup feels balanced and consistent, you make better casts, you manage line better, and you stay focused on what the fish are doing instead of fighting your own gear. Let me know in the comments whether you've put together a sub-$100 setup that consistently catches fish, because I want to know what worked and what surprised you. And if you've tried any of the rods or reels I mentioned, tell me what kind of fishing you were doing with them. Now, a quick word on what a $100 setup cannot realistically do, because being honest about the limits is just as useful as explaining the capabilities. This setup is not built for heavy saltwater fishing. Corrosion will reach the reel internals, the rod guides, and the hardware faster than many anglers expect, and replacement cost quickly cancels out the savings. It is not the right tool for large or powerful species. Heavy striped bass, large catfish, or offshore saltwater targets where drag performance, frame rigidity, and line capacity all need to be significantly higher. And it is not a setup that will grow with you indefinitely. When you start fishing more frequently, more seriously, or in more demanding conditions, the components that were acceptable at $30 will start to show their limits. That is not a failure of the budget setup. It is simply the point at which a targeted upgrade in one or two components makes a real difference. And here is what I think matters most about the $100 setup concept. It is not a consolation prize for anglers who cannot afford better gear. It is a legitimate starting point that catches fish, teaches you what you actually need, and prevents you from spending $300 on a combination of things that don't fit your fishing situation. A lot of anglers who have spent real money on gear will tell you they wish they had started simpler, fished more, and learned before they bought. The setup we talked about today gives you everything you need to do that, with nothing wasted. Good fishing gear is not the gear with the highest price, or the most bearings, or the lightest weight in the catalog. It is gear that fits the way you fish, survives the conditions you put it through, and does its job without creating another problem. A well-matched $100 setup does exactly that for the majority of freshwater anglers. And the fish genuinely do not care what logo is on the side of your reel. Hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who is trying to get started or is thinking about rebuilding a setup without emptying their wallet. I'm Jerry Davis, and I'll catch you in the next one.